allow folks to load. We'll see what we get at 8 in the morning. I think we'll get a different kind of audience. 8 in the morning is not our usual time for broadcasting, but welcome to day 2 of J Street's National Convention. This is, the real day 1, now that the meet really begins. And we've added this program this morning, just an additional emergency briefing on Iran, the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and what is happening. We have with us 2 of J Street's policy fellows, Frank Lowenstein, who has done a whole bunch of different things in his career, including, in U.S. Senate and also working as a special envoy for Middle East peace, or special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Just to be very exact about my terminology, during the Obama administration. And we have Jen Gavito, who spent her career working at the State Department on Middle East issues and also Europe and other things, including as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. That's like the number 2 person at the State Department working on Middle East issues. And we also all of us actually work together on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So Jen, I know you're going to have to hop at some point, so I'm going to start with you. But really the first question to both of you is all right, what are you thinking now? Where are we? And what are your reactions?
Sure. And thanks, Alon. So I think that on day 2 of this conflict, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. And if you start with the question of how does this unfold and when does it finish, it's really hard to answer that at the moment because we don't know why it started or what the objective is. And until those questions are answered, it is very difficult to predict how this trajectory goes. President Trump, just over 24 hours ago, released a video that suggested that in the end, regime change in Iran was in fact the objective of this operation. The challenge here is that regime change in Iran is kind of an undefined notion, right? Unlike a place like Syria, where one man holds a lot of the levers of power, Iran is a multi-millennia bureaucracy that looks much more similar, in fact, to, say, the United States when it comes to regional governments, local governments, military versus civilian, et cetera. And so how the U.S. administration is thinking about regime change and what the definition even of that is will, I think, dictate where this goes. We know that the supreme leader has been killed, and we know that several other key Iranian figures were with him. So I think we can all objectively agree that the world is a better place without the Iranian supreme leader. That being said, the Iranian regime is not comprised of one man, and certainly not one man who's 86, 87 years old, has been suffering from cancer for over a decade, and whose death was almost certainly envisioned when Iran in recent weeks knew that it was going to be going back into conflict. And so is that enough? Do Israel and the US call it a day and say, we have done a regime change now, the supreme leader is gone, we can go home, kind of in a Venezuela type sense where you hand it off to somebody that you think is maybe moderately better than he was? Or do you really go for the jugular and try to unseat all of these levers of power? And I don't think we have answers for that yet. For the Iran regime itself, there is an interim council that has taken over, comprised of the president, a member of a cleric, and the chief justice. They will be working very hard to demonstrate that they are still in full control, despite the economic crisis that was already plaguing them, and of course now the conflict. But I think the Iranian people are a real wild card here. We've seen celebrations. How much do they demand at this point? And I think those answers will come in the coming days.
Yeah, and Frank, maybe just initially, first question to you is, what are your reactions? What do you think is going on right now?
Yeah, well, I think Jen raised exactly the right point, which is what is the objective of this mission? What does success look like? And I think it's clearly regime change. And I think that in terms of the negotiations, I don't think they were ever serious about those. I read some reports in the Israeli press that this mission had been planned down to the day 2 months ago. So I think that this has been the objective all the way along. This is Netanyahu's plan. This is in a lot of ways it's Netanyahu's war, right? He's the one who's had the notion that we had to do anything possible to unseat the regime. So I've got 2 sets of questions. The first is what happens next? What are the Iranians' capabilities to extract a price? Because now we have killed their leader. They've said all red lines have been crossed. So what are the type of responses that they're capable of of if they feel like they are completely unconstrained at this point and have nothing to lose. So we don't know exactly how many missiles they have, or we certainly don't know how many launchers they still have capable. So are they, I saw a ballistic missile hit inside of Israel today and killed some people. Do they have the capacity to do a lot more of that? How much can they target our ships? How much can they target our bases? And then my real concern is there a terrorism component to this? If the Iranian regime really feels like they've got nowhere else to go, can they start attacking civilians? We certainly can't protect all of our civilians in the region, and certainly not, to Jews around the world if they ever go down that path. So I think that how long this lasts will depend on just how much pain the United States feels as a result of this, because I think the plan is somewhere between 4 and 10 days of this. I think that's about as many munitions as we have left, and I think that's what one of the generals described it as. It's a race. Well, we run out of interceptors before they run out of missiles. So I think the point at which we begin to suffer some damages, that's the point at which we'll start looking for a way out of this. But the other question, and I'll get to this later, though, is what does regime change actually look like, right? Normally, when you have a change of regime, the guys with guns turn on the regime, right? Here, the guys with guns are the regime. So how is it that you're going to unseat the IRGC, which is not only deeply embedded in the government, but also in the economy and every other aspect of life inside of Iran? So are you going to attack every police station, every Basij militia outpost in the entire country? And then if people rise up in the streets, how does that work? How are we going to support them then? We've blown up everything we already can blow. So are we going to be left, even in a best case scenario where the people very bravely rise up and try to, are they not just going to get massacred again by the remnants of the regime? So yeah, I have a lot of questions about how this plays out from here, and a lot of questions about how we're even theoretically going to achieve our end game here.
Yeah. And so you guys raise a lot of questions, actually, just for those of us watching or for those of us here. This is another one of our live filmings of Word on the Street that we're doing. Folks are welcome to, sneak in and sit down if they want to. Here, Elon Goldenberg with Frank Lowenstein and Jen Gavito, two of J Street's policy fellows, and we are talking about where we are in terms of the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. So you two mentioned a series of different things that I want to go through. We talked about regime. We're talking about, how long this goes and what the rest of the conflict looks like. I think it's also worth talking a little bit about how other countries in the region are reacting, as well as kind of like what's happening in Congress. We'll come to that maybe last, Frank, but I know you've got a lot of depth and history there, including around the Iraq War and how different this is. But let's start with the regime. Feels to me, and I just want to get your all's perspective. Yeah, this can go a number of different ways. We were speculating before that, maybe the way this happened was so obvious, getting the whole, group of leadership together, having Khamenei out there so publicly, in his own house, like it's kind of nuts. Maybe they were kind of expecting or not minding this for the 86-year-old. Who knows? But, it seems to me we now have this uncertain moment. You could have a more moderate actor, like actually, Ayatollah Khomeini, his grandson is one of the folks being talked about. He's actually a pretty moderate, reformist type leader. You could have that. You could have Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of Ali Khamenei, who's pretty hardline. And you could just have a regime that's dug down. You could have a world where, I was talking about this yesterday, this kind of looks like post-1991 Saddam, where you have a hardline regime still in place and the U.S. just really absorbed in the region trying to contain. You could have total chaos, which might be maybe the worst case scenario. So Jen, I don't know, how do you see, amongst all these scenarios, like what are you thinking about? What are you watching for? None of us can predict where it goes, or what other scenarios I'm missing here?
I do think that those are the likely scenarios. I mean, it very cleanly broken down, either by and large a continuation of what we have right now or chaos. Mm-hmm. And certainly the regime will be focused on figuring out how to make sure it's the earlier option. And so those elements are still in place. The security services are still in place. They can go out and they have the capacity to squash any sort of uprising that happens. What I'm watching for is as they move, presumably after the 40-day period of mourning, to elect a new supreme leader and set a new course in response to whatever will have happened by that point. I'm watching for the question of, do they try to cosmetically put lipstick on a pig and say, we are taking a more moderate approach? And we've seen this before, right? There have been moderate presidents. Fundamentally, since 1979, you haven't seen a lot of variance in how that leadership has governed Iran. And so there could be some cosmetic changes. There could be some nods to public unhappiness with the regime that enable it to re-grasp some of the power. And I think that is probably what they'll try to do. Also as a nod to the United States, right? I mean, one of going back to the questions that we don't have answers to are, why now? Why did we start this? And I've heard three different justifications. I've heard the nuclear program, I've heard the missile program, and I've heard protection of civilians after the brutal crackdown. We're not sure which it is. And so it's kind of hard to say how you're going to get out of it and which of those three things have to be addressed and how before you move on. But if it is the civilians, then again, maybe you have a scenario whereby a new Iranian government gives assurances to the United States that they will protect civilians and give women more rights, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think I would put a lot of stock in those promises, but they may try to do that. The other option is chaos. And so the other thing I'll be watching for there is what the reaction of the people are. You saw some celebrations last night in Tehran after the death of the supreme leader was announced. Does that get oxygen? Does that take hold, and do people turn out in ways that the regime is not as able to control? Now, if you believe reports that 30,000 people were killed in the uprising last month, it just gives you a flavor of how brutal this regime is and the capacity that they have to squash this. And so that will be the big question that would precede any chaos. What I don't think, and what I caution against, is this idea that, I think a lot of people look to Syria last year and say, well, this can happen there. This is a wholly different scenario. And I don't think that there is a chance that the people rise up and they put elections on the calendar for 6 months from now and elect a new democratic regime and, open the universities and everything goes back to, pre-1979.
Well, with Syria and this can happen there, that revolution last year was preceded by a 10-year civil war, right? And which actually feels a lot more like a possibility here where, I remember being, working on some of these issues like 2012, 2013, when, Syrian uprising really started to turn into a civil war. And everybody thought Assad was just going to topple, and it took years of arming different groups and violence and 500,000 people killed before you came out the other side of it. And Syria got a population that's about a quarter the size of Iran's. So so if this can happen here in Syria, to me is not at all a promising thing. But Frank, what about you? How are you looking at kind of what happens next?
I think the Syria analogy is really illustrative in the sense of there was a very strong armed opposition, right, led by al-Shara that was heading down right, to try to take Damascus. That's a totally different scenario than you have in Iran, where there is no armed opposition. In fact, there's no unified opposition. I don't think there's a great clamor to bring the Shah back. And I think people need to understand the amount of time it takes for one of these revolutions to really be successful. I think Trump is really interested in immediate gratification. But I just read a great book called The King of Kings, which I recommend to everybody, about the 1979 revolution. And this takes place over the course of months and months and months. There's general strikes that occur that shut down the economy. There's the military refusing to fire on protesters. There's a very sick leader there, right, who can't rally anybody to his cause. And even then, it took a year because the military was very, very reluctant to risk their lives and their futures. If you try to do a coup, like in effect have, in this case of Iran, I think it would be the regular military guys rising up against the IRGC and the Basij, right? The security apparatus of the interstate, right, you have the 600,000 or so folks that are in the Iranian military. That's a huge risk for them. And it's a 10 times greater risk for the people going out on the streets. So again, I think it's just important to think through very carefully, step by step, how all this might actually unfold. I think it's extremely unlikely that there will be any kind of a regime change in the short term. Now, there can be a change in the calculus of the regime. There can be a change in the nature of the regime. So I think Larijani is calling the shots right now. I think he's a relatively level-headed guy. He may be looking for a way out of this. Remains to be seen whether he'll do what no prior Iranian leaders were willing to do, which is to really give up their entire enrichment program, limit the range on their ballistic missiles. I'm very skeptical about that. But in any event, people who are looking for immediate results from this campaign, including I would speculate the President of the United States and Prime Minister of Israel, I think this is a longer range regime change play. I think they want to weaken the regime and over time allow the people to rise up. But again, the elements of a successful revolution are not present right now.
Yeah, I mean, I will take one moment because we're getting a lot of doom and gloom. I'll do just the slightly optimistic scenario. If you were to do it, the slightly optimistic scenario I would paint for all this would be, whoever succeeds the supreme leader is more from the, Iran is not a monolith. Even the regime is not a monolith. There are hardliners inside the regime. There are pragmatists inside the regime, kind of guys like Hassan Rouhani, who, the former Iranian president who cut the nuclear deal, the JCPOA 10 years ago with President Obama. Like, those folks still exist in the system. They've been generally weakened and marginalized over the years. But there is a world where if one of those becomes the next leader of Iran, there's a way to do this with a relatively healthier transition where you have that calculus change both internationally and maybe even some loosening of that, of the restrictions on the system. That's the optimistic scenario. I don't think that's the likely scenario, but I think it's important to just understand, like, how could this still go not too badly? So, Jen, I know we're going to get short on time a little bit. Jen's got to go do TV at some point. But I wanted to now turn to questions about, all right, how long does this last? We see, missile strikes at, Dubai's airport, hotels in Dubai, military bases in Bahrain, in Israel. I think we had strikes in Tel Aviv and in the Jerusalem area today and yesterday. Everybody we know, all of us, I'm sure, have friends and family, who are sitting in shelters right now, day two. How do you see all that? How long do you think this goes? And what are you hearing, from folks, especially also in the region where I know you spend a lot of time in the Gulf? Yeah,
I mean, people in the Gulf are rattled. Like many people, I've been in shelters in Israel, and that sadly has become a way of life. That is not the case in Dubai. For example, where the airport has been hit, the Burj Al Arab apparently took a small drone strike. So this is rattling the Gulf, and it's interesting because it should be rattling the U.S. administration as well. The president famously went to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE in May and signed $1.4 trillion in deals. This really gets to kind of the heart of what the Gulf's model for the future is. And it depends on stability in the region. And so what Iran is effectively doing right now is not just disrupting trade through, for example, the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea, where the Houthis have said that they will start striking again. But they have inserted question into the stability of Saudi Arabia, of the UAE, and to a lesser degree of Qatar. Flights have been suspended, et cetera. And so I think that this is deeply concerning for those Gulf monarchies who will want to get this wrapped up as quickly as possible. They have not yet opened their airspace to the United States, but I think we could plausibly see that. I don't know, but we could. And Iran, on the other hand, is looking at this as an existential crisis, right? For all the reasons that we just talked about. They don't have a lot to lose. They can deplete their arsenal. They can see if they can outlast the United States and Israel and its interceptors in order to inflict the most damage, the most consequence, and the most uncertainty into the region. So as far as how long this goes, the president has said that he has off-ramps in mind. Again, we don't know what those are or what would lead to those, what would lead to that decision. But he has signaled, and we're seeing reports, that the expectation is that this initial campaign would last several days, and then that there would be a pause and a reassessment of where we are. I think Iran's hope is that that reassessment includes pressure from the Gulf countries to wrap this up so that they can get back to their strategic visions for the future, mostly intact.
Yeah, and it's kind of, well, actually, Frank, go ahead. You were going to hop in.
Well, I was just going to say, if you think about it from the Iranian perspective, survival at this point is success, right? You look at the way Hamas approached this. For 2 years, they just got battered and bombed by the Israelis. All their leaders were killed, and they were still hanging around at the end of the day. And I think people got to remember, Iran has 93 million people in it. We're talking about 1 million security forces that they have there in various forms. So at some point, Iran can run out of missiles, run out of the ability to threaten the United States or our allies, at least through conventional means, and still hang on, right? I mean, without any ground troops on the ground, there's really no way to force the regime's hand. I don't see a scenario where they capitulate in negotiations as a result of this bombing campaign. I don't think their fundamental mentality on that has changed. I don't think they say, we surrender, let us give you our missiles, we'll promise never to rebuild our nuclear facilities. I just don't think countries that are being bombed like these guys are right now, who have, a significant military and a prideful history, are going to just capitulate. So at some point, I just wonder what we're achieving with the ongoing bombing raids, right? We're blowing up smaller and smaller, police headquarters around the country. We've taken out, even in just the first day, I think all the biggest IRGC targets. We've taken out all the missile launchers we can. So I just think at some point, neither side's getting anything out of this war anymore. And that's the way these wars in the Middle East generally end, not with a peace agreement, but with both sides saying that they have nothing left to achieve by fighting. What will you be left with at that point, I think, is a deeply damaged regime, right, that has a limited ability to project force on the ground, that's suffered some major, major blows. And the question at that point will be, all right, do you expect the people to rise up in the streets, or can they maintain order there? And that much we don't know right now. But where this goes, I think there's a limited set of military options that we have left at this point. You kill their leader on the first day, blow up the presidential house. Then what can you threaten them with now? Trump saying, if you respond in a way that harms our folks, we're really gonna blow you up this time. But it feels like they've already done that. So I see this lasting for at least another 3 or 4 days. And then I see both sides just sort of starting to say, like, okay, maybe there's a way to stop fighting at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot of unknowns right now on this. Like, I hope you're right. I hope your assessment of 3 to 4 days is the right one. I don't know. Yeah, at least 3 to 4 days. Yeah, because it could be 2 weeks, it could be a month. You need two sides to tango to end this at this point. And so I think you're probably right that neither side has the capacity to keep going in perpetuity, obviously. And we don't really know how much Iran has, how much it's launched, how much it hasn't launched. We don't know, if the Gulf states, for example, when the Gulf states are in a weird position, Jen was talking about access. They didn't want this. Although then there's also reporting that, Mohammed bin Salman, the king of, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, was actually talking to Trump and encouraging him to do this. So there's conflicting views from different Gulf states. There's also the question of, even if they didn't want it, if the Iranians keep hitting their targets, so they're going to eventually just hop on board with the Americans and say, please, use our airspace and strike because to punish the Iranians. I'm not sure this is the smartest strategy from Iran. So there's just so much. Anyone who tells you confidently right now they know where this is going to go and this is their assessment, I don't think I would trust them. I think all of us have to just operate in this space. Frank, I want to turn to one other thing, and we did lose Jen to her TV interview. For anybody who's watching online and has just hopped on, this is Elon Goldenberg. I'm with Frank Lowenstein right now. We are at the J Street National Convention, and we did this emergency additional pop-up session on Iran and what we are seeing, really what I guess now is day 2 of this war. Frank, I wanted to do one last space with you, which is you spent years working in the Senate for John Kerry, and you worked on his presidential campaign. This was, in the Foreign Relations Committee, 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, right during the heat of the Iraq war debate and all those years, which are so definitional. When you look at what's happening now, where do you see the echoes of similarity, and where do you see things different, and and how Congress has reacted in the debate in the lead up to this war, which has been, nothing like that. There was no debate, and so how, as you reflect on your experience, how do you see what's happening now in the debate in this country?
Yeah, thanks, Lon. That's a great question. Well, first of all, obviously, some of the rhetoric was eerily familiar to those of us who were around for the Iraq War, hyping a nuclear threat, hyping the missile threat, calling a threat imminent that was literally anything but. And not being willing to say, in Trump's case, what his real goal was here, which was regime change. That's been the point from the beginning. Everything else has been a sideshow, right? This is Netanyahu's fantasy, and we're just helping him implement it, right? So there was no way to say that out loud for the president, because one of the core elements of MAGA was we don't get involved in long foreign wars that have a regime change result. So I always thought that was a subtext. And I've known people in the military have been saying they're doing this for months, right? And so that's the objective. That's the goal. As far as the role of Congress, I think the War Powers Act is something that people that haven't worked there talk about a lot more than people who have, right? Because there was no, and there's a little bit of it, where you stand depends on where you sit. Because as chief of staff of the Foreign Relations Committee, we did use of force authorizations, one for Libya. But Kerry's view of it was, unless you're committing ground troops, right, you don't really have to have a War Powers Resolution Act. And when we were in the State Department, as you recall, we certainly took the position that absent some major commitment of U.S. Congress. So I think the idea that this is going to be resolved through some kind of congressional action, those things are really symbolic. At this point, I have some ideas that I've talked to Kerry about how to make the War Powers Act work more, practically and functionally. But in any event, for now, that's not one of the outcomes here. What I do think you might see is pressure from the president's own party, right, to start pulling down. And that will happen if U.S. soldiers, God forbid, start getting killed in all this. If the gas prices spike 50%, starts to tip us into what could look like a recession to some people. In other words, when we start paying a price, hopefully that's in treasure and not in blood, but one way or the other, when the political cost to Trump goes up, that's when I think you'll see him pull back. So it's not going to be Democrats, moving a resolution on the war, authorizing the use of force or not. It's going to be people in the president's party saying, hey, this is hurting us. But I got to remember, go back to the State of the Union address. He knew we were going to war at that point, right? The only reason why he didn't say that is because he didn't want the headline out of his speech to be about a war in Iran. He wanted it to be about economic progress and all the great things he's done. So again, this is just counter to Trump's narrative right now. It's counter to the whole MAGA narrative. Right. And so I think at some point the politics of this are just going to flip on Trump. Well, now that, as I said, I think that will be a function of how much of a cost we have to pay for this. But if there's a lot of civilian casualties, say, for instance, we saw reports, I don't know whether they've been finally confirmed, but there was a school with, dozens of Iranian elementary school girls who were killed yesterday. Like, Marjorie Taylor Greene put out a statement right away. I mean, if we start doing what it looks like the Israelis were doing in Gaza for the last 2 years, again, there's going to be blowback of that. So short answer to your question is, I think that there will be political blowback at some point soon if there's a cost that we're paying. And I think that's what will cause Trump to back down, not so much any formal congressional action.
Yeah, no, I think a couple of things on this, at least as I think back to this, for me also, I wasn't, I'll take the prerogative to say I'm just a little bit younger. And as a result of that, I was, still, in graduate school as the war broke out. But it was actually down there working with you in some of those early years. That's when we got to know each other. So I'm not that much younger. A lot younger. But a couple of contrasts I also see. One is there was a real debate before we went to war with Iraq, right? I mean, when President Bush had a State of the Union address in front of Congress, it was about the war in Iraq. There was at least a huge chunk of it, like half of it was about this discussion. There was nothing, I'll tell you, in foreign policy world as of about 10 days ago, I was starting to just try to raise my hand and be like, what's going on? And foreign policy experts were watching this. And even, J Street, we do a lot of different things, including like our online engagement where you're not really shaping the debate. Sometimes you're going with where the conversation's going. The Iran stuff was getting no traction. Nobody was even really paying attention. It was almost like we sleepwalked into this. The president announces something at 2 a.m. That to me feels like very different than the Iraq war. The other thing I'll say is from a public opinion perspective, when we went to war in Iraq, I think the support was in the 70s. When we went to war in Afghanistan, the support was in the 90s. It's early polling the first couple days here. The support's in the 30s and 40s. I mean, nobody wants this. And I think that's also pretty dramatic. So, I do agree. A vote in Congress is not going to change this, but I do think it's really, really important that we have a vote in Congress, and we're going to have those votes in the next couple of days. And J Street will be on the Hill on Tuesday, lobbying for members both in the Senate and the House to vote yes on War Powers Resolution, because that vote in 2002 and the decision that meant that, at that time that, members of Congress and the Senate made became really definitional as years went on Iraq. And that's the kind of vote we're looking at, a potential historic definition. I mean, Barack Obama is not president if Hillary Clinton votes a different way in 2002, for example. And so I think it's really important that we have that conversation and that we try to do as much as we can to hold as much of the party, the Democratic Party, at least, against this. Maybe even get some Republicans, which I think we will get. Rand Paul is on the Senate version. But.
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference, and I was around for that whole Iraq war vote, is that we were committing ground troops. So we were going to get, hundreds, probably thousands of American kids killed. Turned out to be even worse than that. But that's where you really have to have people stand up and say, yeah, we're behind this or we're against it. I think as long as this doesn't involve any real damage to U.S. forces, doesn't involve any casualties for U.S. forces. I don't know if John Kerry was in the Senate right now and he's like he'd say, like, why am I voting against a war where no one's getting hurt and we're taking out some very bad guys. So I just think it's a trickier vote when you're not talking about anybody getting hurt. And I think that's true of the American public writ large as well. It's a distraction from what they want Trump to be working on, which is the economy. Right. And the Democrats all hate Trump, so no matter what he does. Right. So the question on the politics stream is those middle voters, the independent voters, they're just not interested in a war in Iraq. It's all big discussion, win, lose or draw. They want Trump thinking about the economy. Right. And so I think that's where the political pain will start to kick in for the president, is when he starts to see damage to his prospects in the midterm. But again, the rhetoric is very similar to Iraq. And if we were having people going to invade Iraq, if we were going to put ground force in, I think you'd absolutely have to have a vote. And I think it would be a very tough vote for a lot of folks. I think in this case, it feels a little bit like a freebie, again, until it's not. So I come back to the question of what can Iran do that we don't know about right now, right? Can they get the Houthis involved? We assume they will. There's militias in Iraq. They have militias to some degree in Syria. There's Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? If this really turns into a grinding, extended campaign, remember, we couldn't defeat the Houthis after months and months and months of a very intensive air campaign, right? We wound up cutting a sort of separate peace with them and allow them to continue to fight because they're just a really, really hard target. And so, again, I think if these guys all get involved, it starts to feel like a long, grinding war with no clear outcome. I think the pressure will ratchet up over time, just naturally politically that way.
Yeah, and I think that might be kind of a wise note to end on, which is we're just going to have to wait and see. And I think the Iranians have a vote in this. All right. Well, look, thank you, everyone, for joining us for this session. We will continue to have sessions throughout the day. I think our programming is down until about 1 this afternoon here. And then we're going throughout the afternoon with a series of different speakers that we have here. I think today we have sessions on, we'll have some of the leaders of various denominations, religious denominations, Jewish denominations in the United States, conservative, reform, reconstructionists. We're going to have more conversations from the Israeli perspective on what's happening in Iran, and as well as some dialogue on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today, and more programming tomorrow. And so please keep joining us, tuning in. For those of you who aren't here, this is what you could have seen, and maybe we'll see you at our next convention. And for those of you who are here, I'm sure you've got a lot more of this coming today. Thanks, everybody.
3:45, everybody. Awesome session on the West Bank. See you there.